The student is the hero of the legend, and the story is told so as to foster our sympathy with him. And of course, those of us who are educators may feel a bit guilty about identifying with the student, taking sides with him against our colleague, the professor. But I want to suggest to you that it's in fact appropriate for us to identify with the student, because as students ourselves, we need to use our powers of observation to reveal our otherwise invisible media environments. But also, at the same time, as scholars, we need to use our powers of understanding to make meaning out of our media environments and to understand their effects. And that is what media ecology is really all about. And in this talk, my focus is going to be on Marshall McLuhan, but I want to make it clear that media ecology is more than McLuhanism. Its roots can be traced to the studies of technology that were produced by Louis Mumford, and then later on by Peter Drucker and Jacques Ellul, to the research on oral tradition, writing systems, and typography associated with Eric Havelock, Walter Ong, Jack Goody, Denise Schmidt-Becerrat, as well as Lucien Febvre, Henri-Jean Martin, and Elizabeth Eisenstein, to the studies of media and culture of Harold Innis, Edward T. Hall, Edmund Carpenter, and James Carey, and to the investigations into symbolic form carried out by Alfred Korzybski, Suzanne Langer, Dorothy Lee, and Neil Postman, to name a few people. I know it's a lot of names, but the point is that it's an ecology, a network, an ecology of scholars that make up this field. Media ecology is the study of media as media, which follows from McLuhan's famous maxim, the medium is the message. The medium is the message is McLuhan's wake-up call to individuals like the professor, who, like most people, tend to ignore the medium and only pay attention to content. In effect, McLuhan was trying to say, it's the medium, stupid. And McLuhan's goal was the liberation of the human mind and spirit from its subjugation to symbol systems, media, and technologies. And this can only begin with that call to pay attention to the medium, because it is the medium that has the greatest impact on human affairs and not the specific messages we send or we receive. It's the symbolic content that is a symbolic form, that's most significant, not the content of that form. And it's the technology that matters the most, its nature, its structure, not our intentions or the way that we use it. It's the materials that we work with and the methods we use to work with them that have most to do with the final outcome of our labors. Now, of course, there are those who disagree with this point of view. For example, there's the National Rifle Association. Their slogan is, guns don't kill people, people do. If you disagree with this argument and believe that there is a greater potential for violence with firearms than without them, simply by their existence, then you believe that the medium is the message. If you do agree with the NRA, then I have other things for you to consider. For example, Henry David Thoreau said, on the building of the railroads, we do not ride on the railroad, it rides on us. And Mark Twain had a very funny line that when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. The medium is the message because content cannot exist without a medium. Words can take the form of speech or writing, for example, or they can exist as internalized speech inside the mind, the product of nerve impulses in the brain. But there's got to be some physical basis for them in matter or in energy. And the different forms that they take determine what their meaning is and determine their impact. The words we think to ourselves sound different when we outer them out loud. The words we write down take on a permanence, distance, and impersonal quality in comparison to speech. Along the same lines, information does not exist in a vacuum. It can be found riding radio waves, or on the electronic current running through wires, or stored in magnetic or optical form, or in sequences of chemicals that make up strands of DNA and RNA. but the code and the mode of information that's used will determine who has access to the data, who controls its dissemination, how much information will be distributed, how fast it'll be distributed, how far it'll travel, how long the information will remain available, and the form in which it'll be displayed. As these variables change, so does the message that is being communicated. Now, artists have long understood this. They've long understood that the medium is the message, and that the same subject will yield an entirely different effect if the image, for example, for painters, if it's painted using oil paint, or if it's painted using watercolors, or alternately if it's sketched using charcoal, or for sculptors, that decision whether to chisel a bust out of stone or carve it out of wood or mold it out of clay will yield a very different artwork. And musicians understand that the same melody changes if it's played on violin or played on trumpet or played on xylophone or kazoo. You ultimately essentially get different pieces of music. The medium is the message as well because the medium precedes the message. Before we produce the finished product, we have to have the raw materials that we need and the means to shape them. Before we can encode a message, we need the code. Before we learn how to talk, we first start to babble. The sounds that babies make, goo goo gaga, and the like, are the sounds of the medium of speech without the linguistic content. First, we learn how to recognize and make the significant sounds of our language. Only later do we learn how to make the significant symbols, that is, spoken words. Now, McLuhan also argued that the medium is the message because the content of a medium is, in a certain way, another medium. For example, the medium of speech becomes the content of writing. The medium of writing becomes the content of print. The medium of print becomes the content of word processing, hypertext, and any other form of electronic writing. J. David Bolter and Richard Bruson refer to this process as remediation. And they point out that the computer and computer networks remediate just about every other medium in existence, turning written documents, books, magazines and newspapers, paintings and photographs, sound recordings, telephone conversations, and of course radio, movies, and television, all into content for websites and multimedia presentations. At the same time, of course, computer displays and interfaces can themselves be remediated as content for older media. You can see them in motion pictures or on television. When one medium becomes another medium's content, it becomes the code, the symbolic form, or the style, the aesthetic style that's used to create specific messages. Now, McLuhan explained that another reason why the medium is the message is because the user is the content. What he meant was that audiences and readers must interpret the messages they receive, they must process the sensory data they take in. We make meaning out of what we get from our environment and the artifacts that exist in them and the events that occur in them. The point here is that we interpret, we create the message to a large extent. And that's happening on the receiving end of communication. And if that's the case, if we're doing it, then the effect it's having on us is relatively limited because we're creating it. And therefore, it's the medium and not the message that is actually affecting us that has the greatest influence on the user and the audience. And put another way, it's the context that determines the content. And context is another way of understanding what a medium is.